Hello and welcome to On Air with Aashka. Today we have Quinn Anex-Ries as a guest for our episode. Quinn is a senior policy analyst at the Center for Democracy and Technology. He is on the Equity in Civic Technology team where he focuses on government use of AI. He has a background in technology and civil rights and holds a PhD in American Studies and Ethnicity from the University of Southern California. In this episode, policy expert Quinn takes us behind the scenes of government use of AI, exposes the reality of how government agencies evaluate AI models for procurement, be it open source models or closed source models. Come join us as we navigate the public sector AI use and implementation, where even small mistakes can devastate citizens' lives with no opt-out option. Your recent article discusses lawsuits related to Elon Musk's DOGE, that is Department of Government Efficiency, members accessing highly sensitive information like social security numbers and pensions. How can you balance the push for government efficiency with the need to protect the privacy rights of the government officials at the same time?
A massive data breach is an inefficient point blank. Having a huge adverse incident that then government has to spend massive time and resources responding to and attempting to rectify harm is wildly expensive, super time consuming, and you can't undo it. Once the data is out there, it's out there. So as a threshold matter, we have privacy and cybersecurity requirements in place for decades because preventing these problems saves time and saves money and makes sure that tax dollars are spent efficiently. The state of Michigan implemented an algorithmic tool to help identify fraud in their unemployment insurance program. This led to it's about 40,000 Michigan residents that were falsely identified as fraudulent claimants of unemployment insurance. Some people were so impacted that they had to file bankruptcy as a result of this issue. Unfortunately, in this case, the chatbot was providing advice to local businesses to break local laws. So this is a big problem.
To become an irresponsible citizen of this city, right?
Exactly. So even this maybe seemingly benign or lower risk thing can actually have really high risks if you make sure it's going to work well.
Yes, yeah.
People like to think of these as like a plug and play thing. I can replace this really human intensive process with this easy widget that'll mean no people have to be involved and it's not that much work. Actually, it's a lot of work to do it right. It's a lot of work to make sure you're getting the right thing in the first place. They often tend to be more closed source systems. I can't think of any immediate examples of a bunch of open source. The GovAI Coalition is a coalition of hundreds of city governments, county governments, state governments that came together and said, we're all trying to acquire this stuff. We're really having trouble getting vendors to work with us, whether it's model cards, information on training data, that kind of thing.
Hello and welcome to On Air with Aashka. Today we are joined by Quinn, who is making sure that government AI serves the citizens and not harm them. Thank you so much for joining us on a Friday, Quinn. It feels fantastic to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me today. I'm excited for the conversation.
So your background seems to be very interesting. It spans from chemistry, biomathematics, American studies, gender studies. Okay, you have done a bit of everything. So how does this interdisciplinary perspective shape your approach in AI policy? And do you think AI policy benefits from such diverse academic perspectives?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll help to talk a little bit about why my trajectory looks the way that it does. In undergrad, I actually started as a chemistry and biomathematics major. Really loved it. Really loved doing lab work. But I was the lab I was working in was working on these advanced materials chemistry that, as I thought about it, I was like, oh, this is going to be a product. And it kind of dawned on me okay, this is an interesting thing that matters because it was for cancer therapeutics. But only the 1% of the 1% would afford this thing if it was out in the world. And that made me start asking questions about how does all of this stuff in society and economic stratification and inequality impact the things that we think are often insulated from that in the lab? And so then I was that led me to want to double major in the humanities in undergrad, basically. To study the sciences and technology from a humanist perspective. I think you still get a lens into what does STEM as a field look like, which I think made me then a better practitioner as someone who studies how those fields impact our society. And I think equipped me with some skills to be a translator between technical questions and maybe more kind of social science kind of questions. So that's a long way of saying, like, I came to that background because of the kinds of things I was interested in by starting from a technical side. So personally, that benefited me a lot because I started asking different kinds of questions from the humanities, having seen how lab research plays out. For instance, I was thinking about, okay, if I'm thinking about the impact of this technological tool, I actually need to ask questions about how is it designed in the research phase? What assumptions fed into that design that then shaped certain outcomes? So I think that's the biggest thing for me. But more than that, I think any kind of interdisciplinary or unique background coming to AI policy helps the field as a whole be less monolithic and understand problems from different lenses. So I think now, as someone with a PhD who often works with a lot of lawyers, it can actually be a huge benefit to be someone that's not going to come in and ask something from a really like legalese perspective and maybe ask it from a more social science or humanities perspective to maybe turn something on its head or phrase something differently. So I think in any different kind of policy space, having that diversity of perspective is always helpful. But especially a field like AI policy that's largely dominated by technologists and lawyers, having people come in with a more socio-technical background is really critical.
Yes. And also you can see AI from chemical, biological, whatever different kinds of risks that are associated with AI. So of course your knowledge from undergrad, masters, and also the PhD comes into picture and helps you create the best policies that are for the people, of the people, and by the people.
Exactly, especially since AI is a tool that basically touches every sector.
Yes,
Unlike
exactly.
other developments in technology that might be more siloed to specific sectors,
Yeah.
it touches everything. So you kind of have to have ways to understand those multi-sectoral impacts.
Yes. And often AI is compared with electricity to be omnipresent in the future. Right now it is not, but it will pick up soon. Let's move on to the next question. You work at the Center for Democracy and Technology, a public policy nonprofit that supports corporate and public sector policies and technological tools that protect privacy, security, and enable free speech online, essentially the superhero team for digital rights. When most people think about who shapes such tech policies, or the picture lobbyists in expensive suits or lawmakers sitting at the White House or the US Senate, yet organizations like yours manage to influence both corporate giants and government agencies. So could you give us some BTS or behind the scenes, like how does your organization make it happen, with some real world example, like a recent example?
Absolutely. Yeah, like you said, the Center for Democracy and Technology, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit.
Uh-huh.
Um, and really, I think like you're laying out, what sets organizations like ours apart from the broader landscape of lobbying in DC is we represent the interests of the public and not private
Yeah.
interests or a specific organization or set of people, but broadly public interest in democracy and protecting democratic values online. Um, so we need more of that in the world, but having organizations that don't have, financial ties or other political ties to representing some other interest is really important to have a diverse range of voices and conversations around tech policy broadly, but AI policy specifically. So an organization like ours, I would say one of the kind of core things that really is our calling card is that our advocacy and policy is deeply technically informed. So our staff is a mixture of technologists, lawyers, public policy experts. So what we're able to provide to people as a value is that our work is always based in fact and evidence and what actually are the technical realities of the technology that we're talking about. So the kind of three main ways we go about that is, one, we do firsthand research. We do qualitative and quantitative work to better understand how these tools impact people on the ground, the kinds of problems they might be causing, and potential solutions. So for instance, my team put together, one of the things we focus on is the education sector. And so we did research that we do annually where we survey students, parents, and teachers in schools across the country to understand how education technology affects them. And so one of the things we did this fall was to better understand the prevalence of non-consensual intimate imagery in schools and the role that AI tools plays in that. So this is a really important way that our organization, through this kind of firsthand research, can actually help to quantify a problem. So we make sure that our policy recommendations are evidence informed. So that's the first thing, is research. The second is advocacy, right? So we work with coalition partners, with other civil society organizations in this space to push for policy changes that we care about. So that might be through letter writing, public campaigns, speaking, events, that kind of thing. And then the last thing is, we do direct technical advising and lobbying with lawmakers, public administrators, and companies. So like you point out, another thing that kind of makes us unique is we're not just talking to lawmakers on Capitol Hill or lawmakers in state capitals. We're also work with companies to help provide recommendations to them as they make different policy decisions about products they might have in development. So again, it helps us make sure we're talking to everyone important in the ecosystem, but also that we understand the kinds of, considerations or challenges that companies are facing as they're trying to navigate this same policy landscape. I think the different kinds of wins you have in this space can look really varied. Sometimes that looks like calling attention to a really important issue and being able to explain technical wonky stuff in a way that cuts through the noise. So I know we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but one thing around that recently is, we work a lot on data privacy in government. So we've been talking a lot with the press about why some of the reporting around DOGE's access to sensitive personal information in federal agencies is cause for alarm. So that can be a win, where it's just being able to explain these are longstanding privacy protections, this is why they matter, and this is why they might be violated. So that's one kind. We obviously have more concrete kinds of your research is actually used to do a thing. One really great example that really delighted me recently is one of my team's reports about student surveillance in schools that I think was published a number of years ago now. A student organized their own change.org petition because their high school was using one of the student surveillance technologies that we wrote about years ago. And they cite our report in their own change.org petition that they're trying to use to lobby their school for change, right? So that's a small example,
that's the way change is made, yeah.
Exactly. So, it's not just that our research can be cited to other people's reports or regulatory comments, but it can actually help people communicate directly to people in their local communities about why this stuff matters. And then I think the last thing I'll just say is, we also work a lot on legislation, both at the federal and state level, helping provide technical assistance. Will support legislation or oppose legislation, in alignment with our own mission as an organization. And so I think last year, a pretty big win, we're involved a lot with state level AI consumer protection and anti-discrimination bills. And as you know, the state of Colorado passed the first in the nation AI consumer protection bill. So that's a huge win and is reflective not just of our work, obviously, but a lot of civil society organizations that are pushing for those kinds of measures. So it's rare that you get something that concrete, but that's also, an example of the kinds of things we're trying to work towards.
Yes. So you mentioned about this DOGE thing. Just for my listeners, I wanted to reiterate that thing. So your recent article discusses lawsuits related to Elon Musk's DOGE, that is Department of Government Efficiency. Members accessing highly sensitive information about taxpayers like social security numbers and pensions. So in this kind of situation, like how do you or how can you balance the push for government efficiency with the need to protect the privacy rights of the government officials at the same time?
Sure. I think at the outset, I'll say this is that a massive data breach is inefficient point blank, right? Like having a huge adverse incident that then government has to spend massive time and resources responding to and attempting to rectify harm is wildly expensive, super time consuming, and you can't undo it. Once the data is out there, it's out there. So as a threshold matter, we have privacy and cybersecurity requirements in place for decades because preventing these problems saves time and saves money and makes sure that tax dollars are spent efficiently. So I think that's the kind of threshold mindset I take to this. But it's also true that government has to work with limited resources, and it is a noble and good goal to make sure those resources are used well and efficiently. So I think the way that you go about that then while protecting privacy is doing your homework, making sure before you use some kind of emerging technology, whether it's AI or something else, that you're really making sure, is this thing fit for purpose? Do I understand where the training data comes from? Do I understand the kinds of data it will need to use? Do I know the technical environment that it's operating in and the privacy and cybersecurity parameters that are put in place? Have I tested it for real world conditions? Have I identified potential harms? You know, the whole set of things. That's part of just doing your homework to make sure it's going to do the thing that you want it to do, right? There are some headline stories of this stuff going wrong. And not only do you not want to be in the headlines, you also don't want to waste your time having to deal with the thing going wrong and then finding a different solution for it later on, right?
Exactly. Because AI is made to like make yourself more efficient and productive, and not like take you in the other direction wherein you put in a lot of efforts, money, and then again you put in a lot of efforts and money to retract that. So yeah.
Exactly. And I think, you know, I can give a couple examples of the way this can go wrong to kind of help give some detail for folks. So the first is now a kind of common example that people talk about that I think is useful is about 10 years ago now, the state of Michigan implemented an algorithmic tool to help identify fraud in their unemployment insurance program. The tool, though, had, because of some accuracy issues and implementation issues, had a high rate, at least for this context, of false flags of fraud. This led to around, I think it's about 40,000 Michigan residents that were falsely identified as fraudulent claimants of unemployment insurance when they weren't.
So false negatives.
Exactly. Which in this case meant that people weren't getting needed cash assistance at a time when they were out of a job, right? So this is super high stakes.
Yes.
Some people were so impacted that they had to file bankruptcy as a result of this issue. And it took a long time then for the state not only to go through all the litigation that came out of that, but to also undo the problem of a specific system and make sure their new fraud detection tools were working well. So I think that, both shows the kind of stakes of the problem and the level of sort of technical and time-intensive work that has to happen when something goes wrong. A more recent example that folks may have seen last year is the city of New York rolled out a chatbot with the aim of it being a place for residents to find easier information about city services, ask questions about local laws, which is something that on its face, is useful, right?
Yeah.
But in this context, right, I'm sure listeners know well, chatbots can hallucinate, and that's the thing you need to test for. In this case, it's an official source of information coming from a city website. So you really need to make sure that it's not going to hallucinate and tell you something wrong. Unfortunately, in this case, the chatbot was was providing advice to local businesses to break local laws, right? So this is a big problem.
To become an irresponsible citizen of this city, right?
Exactly. So even this maybe seemingly benign or lower risk thing can actually have really high risks if you don't make sure it's going to work well.
Yes. Yeah.
That's super inefficient. Then you have to go and fix the thing, figure out where all the harm was done, reach out to those people. Actually create some more work for you. So I think the thing I would end on this sort of train of thought is I think people like to think of these as it's a plug and play thing. I can replace this really human intensive process with this easy widget that will mean no people have to be involved and it's not that much work. Actually, it's a lot of work to do it right. It's a lot of work to make sure you're getting the right thing in the first place and do all the testing. And it's a lot of work to make sure you have monitoring in place so you can figure out things when they go wrong. So I think approaching it from the mindset of simply this is going to make things easier and not, is it worth all the time? Is it worth the benefits and risks? What has to go into it is really the kind of, I think, place more people need to be thinking about it, especially in the public sector.
Yes. I totally agree. So since you mentioned about this public sector use case and you primarily work on the public sector use of AI, so I wanted to know, when it comes to model development or procurement, so do government agencies really develop models of their own, or do they just procure from third-party open source models or closed source?
That's a great question. The easy answer is a vast majority of AI tools used in government are procured from, third-party vendors. A very small number of systems are developed in-house or, will be based on a commercial product that's then modified in-house. But that is the kind of less common route, which means, I think the important thing to take away, though, is that means most AI tools are coming into government through traditional procurement avenues, which comes with its own set of requirements and rules, and also challenges for agencies to navigate. So I think a question a lot of agencies across all levels of government, federal, state, local, is how do you update and adapt existing procurement processes to account for novel tools like AI?
Yep. What's the hot pick amongst the models? Are open source models preferred, or closed source models, or a mixture of both? Because cost efficient wise, open source makes more sense to me, at least as a layperson, but I'm not sure if that's the only criteria the government agencies are looking for.
So, one of the things that agencies have to look for in procurement processes is, how do these systems comply with our cybersecurity, cloud, privacy, enterprise-wide risk requirements? There's a whole bunch of other stuff you have to cross-tab these things with before you can procure them. So when you look at like the federal use, for instance, a lot of tools are ones that that agencies are using are ones that are integrated into other enterprise-wide software platforms like a Microsoft or a Google or an Amazon. That would be your kind of general purpose, often comes through those existing kind of software platforms. And then you'll see uses that are more kind of specific to certain use cases. So like, we need a tool to do this kind of audit or this kind of fraud detection. So a long way of saying, I think by and large, they often tend to be more closed source systems. I can't think of any immediate examples of a bunch of open source, but that doesn't mean they don't exist.
Yes. Yeah. So you mentioned about this looking at the technical specifications of cybersecurity, privacy, safety, and stuff like that. So, like, what are the key documents of the closed source models that you look at apart from the model cards, or are they enough for you to get that information and choose and pick the right one?
Okay, I think this is a really important question because it's actually a challenge that a lot of especially local agencies face right now. One of the key challenges as governments try to procure these tools is actually getting sufficient information from vendors to fully evaluate the system for risks, for compliance with existing laws, that kind of thing. This was a big enough problem, actually. There's a really interesting group that was created specifically with the intent to tackle it. It's called the GovAI Coalition. So this is a coalition of hundreds of different localities and states. So city governments, county governments, state governments, they came together and said, we're all trying to acquire this stuff. We're really having trouble getting vendors to work with us. And so their idea was if they worked together, they could more easily get some of this information from vendors about whether it's model cards, information on training data, that kind of thing. And it started to work to help them in the process. But I think it's still a really common challenge of how do you productively work with vendors to get enough information to do the kind of vetting you want to do in government? The other thing I'll just say here is, in a lot of governments, procurement officers, they're not experts in AI. They're experts in how to do government procurement, which is what you want them to be.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But it's really important then that you have these interdisciplinary teams, especially in the context of AI, that are working together from the phase of developing your RFP through the evaluation, through issuing a contract. You need to have someone from your, Department of Technology, for instance, and your Office of Civil Rights and your Office of Accessibility working with your procurement expert to figure out, okay, what actual specifications do we need to have in this RFP, both from a technical perspective and a legal compliance perspective. And I think and because AI is so complicated, it really demands that kind of interdisciplinary work in a way that some other procurement processes might.
Yeah, it's refreshing to hear that there is some interdisciplinary work going on in there, and we are not blindly trusting the government officials who don't know much about the AI models. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, so I have worked in the private sector AI companies, and I have seen that many private sector AI companies face competitive pressures that sometimes leads to rushing products to the market before thorough testing, safety testing. So do you see similar kind of tensions in the public sector as well, where agencies might implement AI systems prematurely without doing enough safety testing or without putting enough guardrails in place? And if so, what do you consider the most significant risks when government agencies deploy AI without proper guardrails in place? And do you have any particular example? What's coming next? We will dive into AI sandboxes, AI regulation trends across different states, what can we learn from Maryland and New York's AI governance strategies, and much more. He also shares his thoughts about how one can become irreplaceable in this AI age. Please do like, share, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to make the YouTube algorithm happy and help us build an informed community that is excited about AI's benefits while staying aware of its risks. Stay tuned for the next part of this episode. This is Aashka signing off for now. Let's ride these airwaves again soon.